Greetings and welcome to Exposure. Hi, Stuart.
Hey, Jill.
I was hoping you would be here in person with me, but due to pretty extreme weather this morning, we're gonna pull this episode together through Zoom. So there's so much to cover and so many issues. And today we wanted to talk about an event that happened recently in an effort to highlight some of the amazing work happening with our Beyond Petrochemical Coalition partners. Big movement here for a long time now, really, trying to halt the petrochemical expansion, and in that process, exposing the connection between fracking and cracking to make plastic, and also a lot of the false solutions that the petrochemical and plastic industries are promoting, including chemical recycling, advanced recycling, and that's what we want to talk about a little bit today, including the SOBE Thermal Energy Systems LLC project that's been planned and in the works for Youngstown, Ohio, and concerned citizens in that area held an event last Friday on Valentine's Day to bring attention to the fact that a year ago, the Ohio EPA issued permits for the SOBE facility, even though they had valid opposition and testimony, including from the mayor of Youngstown and the council, serious concerns and facts presented about why this was not a good idea for their community. And yeah, Stuart, do you want to speak a little bit? You were there, and then we can play a little bit of the recording you got while at the rally.
So yeah, I went to the event. It was at the Dorothy Day House, and let's listen to a little bit of Lynn Anderson's talk here, and then we can kind of jump in from there.
On February 14, 2024, the Ohio EPA issued a final air pollution permit to SOBE Energy Solutions for an untested, experimental, not proven safe thermalizer that is a technology that has never been used successfully to create synthetic gas from plastics, to be located at SOBE's property at 205 North Avenue, which is right down the street from here. It would definitely affect the Dorothy Day House and many residents, the Ohio Urban Renaissance Center that takes care of pre-college kids, giving them classes and a basketball team, etc. The Ohio EPA unwisely issued a final air pollution permit, a 10-year air pollution permit, despite massive opposition voiced by Youngstown residents at the draft permit public hearing they convened on August 10, 2023. Ohio EPA ignored hundreds more postcards demanding that no final air pollution permit be issued that were sent during this public comment period on this draft permit. The Ohio EPA even ignored Region 5 U.S. EPA Director John Mooney's correspondence stating that they should correct some erroneous computer modeling data, misstating how much pollution would actually be emitted by this pyrolysis plant. They ignored his advice that the Ohio EPA must not issue a final permit without considering environmental justice factors, because Youngstown has been declared to be an environmental justice community of concern by the U.S. EPA due to our decades of pollution by steel mills that have compromised the health of our residents. Despite all this, and despite the fact that SOBE is located in a mixed-use community zone that does not allow them to expand into industrial operations from their currently approved use, which is producing steam heating and cooling only. And despite the fact that Youngstown's mayor and city council had placed a 1-year moratorium ordinance against pyrolysis and gasification, in effect to protect the health of Youngstown residents, the Ohio EPA issued a potentially damaging and dangerous 10-year air pollution permit to SOBE.
That was Lynn Anderson from SOBE Concerned Citizens, and you know, the vibe that I got from everybody there echoed everything that she was saying. They're just really deeply disappointed in the fact that the Ohio EPA has kind of gone against the community's clear, clear desire to not want this project, or at the very least to investigate it further. So the Ohio EPA kind of went against the mayor and the city council and the rest of the community there. And that's a big controversy right now in that area.
Yeah, but it's not surprising to me, who over all these years of experiences dealing with Ohio EPA, Ohio Department of Natural Resources, bought and sold by the industry. I mean, regulatory capture, incident after incident, so I'm not surprised, but it's certainly still disappointing. But it's also very encouraging in the Youngstown community that the residents there have been able to gather the support of the mayor, of the city council, because that's not always the case, and so I do think that they're in a position of power there, and they're continuing to try to build momentum and gather support. And one of the things that they're asking, and at that event, was for the Ohio EPA to rescind these permits, these air permits. Isn't that right, Stuart?
Yeah, that's kind of the call to action right now. Now, to be clear, the moratorium is still in place. And so what this does is my understanding is that the permit doesn't allow SOBE to continue because the moratorium is still there and there are still some zoning issues. But what it does do is it puts a lot of pressure on Youngstown at the state, from the state level, to push this project forward. And it kind of signals that at the state level, Ohio wants this project to continue. And that to me is like a real disconnect. Like you said, that we see time and time again where the communities that are actually impacted by these projects are pretty clear-eyed about the risks. And they feel, in the case of Youngstown, there's this legacy of environmental injustice where these industries have been able to pollute the town. And the people who live there have not really reaped any of the benefits of that. And so here you have a very clear example of a community that's kind of standing up for themselves, standing in opposition of this industry or this company. And you have the state level EPA basically saying, no, we're going to issue this permit anyway. And by the way, that was also in opposition to the federal EPA, which had written a letter, a pretty strongly worded letter to the Ohio EPA, heavily criticizing their initial draft of the permit. Now, the Ohio EPA did make some adjustments based on that letter, but they still left a lot of those recommendations out of their final permit. And to me, it begs a broader question of you're the Ohio EPA, why did the federal EPA have to come and tell you that you should be testing for dioxins and things like that?
Right, exactly.
Why wasn't that just an automatic thing,
You know what, dioxins, where I go to immediately, Stuart, when I hear that, is East Palestine and meeting you, and how the community scientists, the local residents, who were speaking to the experts through campaigns and calls like Beyond Petrochemicals and Break Free from Plastics, getting the support we needed and the knowledge residents there on the ground needed to know what should they be testing for, right? And so they weren't testing for it until, you know, people started demanding it. Researchers started, the citizens started asking for it. So, but in this situation, you're saying the federal EPA stepped in and said, hey, this needs to be done.
Yeah, this needs to be better. Because, and the thing too is what you just made me realize is there's always this like gaslighting that happens too, which is where like when the EPA did finally start testing for dioxins out of East Palestine, they kind of acted like, what, you know, what's the problem? Like we're testing for dioxins. It's like, yeah, after months of us telling you, like pleading with you to do that. So
Right.
there's always this like gaslighting element to it as well. But yeah, I mean, the fact that you have a state EPA that drafted a air permit for a plant that's you know, a pyrolysis plant. Pyrolysis is known to be highly toxic and known to have huge environmental impacts. And the fact that they initially drafted such a weak permit, so much so that the federal EPA had to step in and write a letter saying, hey, you have to fix these things. And then they ignored a lot of those recommendations in their final draft. It's just a mess. You know, it's not what I think people expect from the EPA.
Those who still have faith and trust in them, which I've lost a long time ago. The state regulators, you know, but the federal EPA, we've had success with them and they've worked with us. And so thank God that they stepped in here, and maybe the permit's a little better because of that, but it's still unacceptable that that they issued the permit when there was so much resistance and for good reasons. The research was presented. It's like, just like, oh, we don't want this. There's specific reasons why, you know, legitimate, that were presented to Ohio EPA, and they ignored them even from the feds, you know?
Yeah, and so, I mean, on that note, we should probably talk a little bit about what pyrolysis actually is. For our viewers who don't know, you know, the SOBE plant, the proposed plant here that we're talking about will be a pyrolysis plant, which is kind of it's not so much incinerating rubber, it's like a chemical incineration of rubbers and plastics to make energy. And this pyrolysis is sold as a waste to energy green solution for rubber and plastic waste. But in practice, it has a really terrible track record and a lot of questionable science behind it. And most pyrolysis plants tend to go belly up either because they fail to properly mitigate environmental issues, so they spread toxins all over their communities, and they have a lot of violations of environmental regulations, or because it's just not really that financially viable, and a lot of plants end up closing and shuttering just because it doesn't make a lot of sense financially.
Right, exactly. And Beyond Plastic and the International Pollutants Elimination Network produced a report in 2023 that talks about, you know, a lot of the issues with chemical recycling and the greenwashing that goes into it by the industry. And the report's authors counter that chemical recycling is really a risky business. And according to their research, the chemical recycling process creates large amounts of toxic waste and toxic emissions that can cause significant human health problems, while the facilities themselves have been prone to fires and explosions. And of course, this one's right inside a community, very concerning. The authors write that the processes, far from offering a solution, can create as much as 100 times more damaging environmental impacts than virgin plastic production, which seriously causes which seriously calls into question the efficiency and the environmental benefit of chemical recycling. And of course, the plastic producers and the fossil fuel companies argue that chemical recycling presents a solution to the world's plastic problem, since it is intended to process plastics that can traditionally not be recycled, and says they'll keep them out of the environment.
I think that it kind of gets to a core issue that we keep coming back to, which is that the oil and gas and petrochemical industries have serious waste issues, and there isn't a good way to eliminate those waste those waste streams. And so they continue to create these false solutions to get rid of their waste. And there are almost always ways to externalize the costs of truly mitigating those waste streams onto communities, taxpayers, and the environment. And this is just kind of one of many examples of that occurring. And it's worth noting the environmental justice factor of this, where it's like, one of the things that I continually see is you have a company that wants to come into a community, and the community says no, but the company doesn't take that and go away. They keep hammering that community, and you have to ask at some point, like, why? Why does this company keep trying to get into a community that has made it very clear that it's not welcome? And I think that the answer is really that it's not an affluent, powerful community. And so the industry knows that communities that have a history of injustice, that have a history of poverty or poor education or this, that, or the other thing that make them kind of a disenfranchised community, those are prime targets for these industries. And that seems to me to be the only explanation as to why you would continue to try to push into a community that has made it, told you loud and clear that they don't really want you there.
Because they don't care. It's about profit over people, time and time again. Yeah. And it starts with the oil and gas industry, and that leads to petrochemical facilities, then these proposed, to make plastic. Then you've got these facilities that show up to say they're going to solve the plastic pollution problem by these advanced recycling facilities, which in fact just create more pollution and more problems and use more chemicals and pollute the air more, pollute the water more, make the community sicker. So on every level, starting with the fracking, to cracking, to make plastic, to then how are we going to deal with the waste, it all is falling on communities who've for generations been exploited, poisoned, But on a hopeful note, hearing Lynn's speech, it's really encouraging to know that communities are not giving up. And this is not the first battle in Youngstown, I'm sure, over this polluting facility or another. They're continuing to find encouragement. The ranks, the troops are growing in a sense, more people are becoming aware as more studies come out about how terrible plastic is for not only the oceans and the environment, but for human health. I just saw a study, and I've told several people and they just don't believe me, but basically, and all the brains in the study that the scientists tested, that there was an equivalent of a plastic spoonful, a plastic spoon, the size of a plastic spoon, that much of microplastics in a brain. Am I really saying that right? And it is true. I can't even believe it, no matter how many times I've said that, the last week or so.
Yeah, I saw the same thing this morning. I didn't have a chance to read the actual study, but it was about them finding a lot of microplastics in human brain tissue. You can't get away from it. Microplastics, forever chemicals. And the thing about it is this is a very, if you listen to Joe Rogan or any other popular podcasts, one of the kind of recurring themes that pops up over and over again is why do we have so many unexplainable chronic diseases, you know, and there's such a focus on food, which is obvious, and there's a focus on sort of like activity levels,
Right.
but like this seems to me to be like one of the most obvious reasons that we are just bathing ourselves in toxins and microplastics and forever chemicals. And the fact that we sort of continue down that path, and anyone who sort of questions the industry narrative or tries to stand in the way is just automatically labeled as like, you know, an obstructionist of progress, or you want to kill jobs, you want to kill the economy. And it's like, no, this is just an obvious problem. You know, that we're building these facilities and they're just allowed, like the Beaver Cracker plant is legally allowed to dump 1 million pounds of VOCs into that community every year. And they've gone over that limit time and time again.
But for people who don't know what the Beaver Cracker plant is, it's a massive, giant facility right kind of in the community at the edge of town that is cracking the ethane to make single-use plastics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the other, point that comes to mind is, you got drill baby drill, but then there's also those like, we need more plastic, and there are people like that who just deny. But I think it's going to get harder and harder for the petrochemical industry to continue, especially as more and more residents become aware in communities and continuing to rise up like they are in Youngstown with SOBE and other fights throughout the Ohio River Valley, Louisiana, and Texas. Got coalition partners across those 3 states and throughout the country and world, really. But and then you have all these researchers and studies coming out about the health impacts of plastic. And then the industry and regulators are buying the industry line and narrative of like, oh, but chemical recycling and advanced recycling and facilities like SOBE and others, that's the solution. And it isn't.
Mm-hmm.
No,
and there's a lot of we keep trying to do this thing where, and I say we as in like human society, we keep trying to, I think, solve an unsolvable problem. You know, like we are digging all this toxic soup up from deep underground, we're burning it, we're coming up with all these different uses for it, and those are useful, there's no doubt about that. But in the process, we are toxifying our planet to the point where it's impacting us in serious ways. And we keep just trying to like come up with these creative ways to mitigate that, but each solution just ends up creating more and more problems. And the further you go down the road, it just seems to be an unsolvable issue. These chemicals are not, we don't seem to be able to just render these chemicals inert. And so every time they go through a process to turn into something else, it ends up, releasing some other toxin. The radioactivity issue is a perfect example of that. It's like once you bring it up to the surface and you spread it all over the place, that's it. You can't really go back. You can't unring these bells.
Which you bring up radioactive waste, and to make the connection clear, fracking, you have to have it to make plastic. And what you get with fracking that a lot of people still don't know, a lot more comes up to the surface than oil and gas.
Mm-hmm.
Which is radioactive. You've got uranium, lead, arsenic, polonium, selenium, all these toxic substances are brought to the surface. And then local community members, local workers, and, you know, some who've come from other places, they're being exposed, not only the workers first, and then the community at large, our aquifers and our water supplies, because they're using injection wells to inject the radioactive waste back in the ground. They're going and down blending it in these facilities, and then some of it's going to landfills. Some of it's probably getting dumped over the road. I'm just saying that there's so many levels of risk and exposure with oil and gas, which equals plastic, which equals a disaster for our planet and human health and life in general, overall, everywhere.
Yeah, and so all of this begs the question, like, why? And, you know, we know it's money, obviously, but one of the things that I'm starting to learn more about is just how convoluted the money is in a lot of these situations, the amount of financial engineering that goes into making these solutions quote unquote viable. And the more that I dig into it, the more it starts to look like the housing crisis in 2008, where you had financial institutions essentially buying toxic mortgages and then folding them into these attractive financial products that then they would sell to investors. And so a lot of these false solutions seem to be built on a very similar model where they promote this as a green solution, and that entices government tax incentives, tax abatements, subsidies, etc. And that reduces the risk for private investors. So then they can go to the private investor class and get a bunch of money dumped into this green solution. And by the time that, you know, you've gone through like overinflated construction costs and inflated admin costs and consulting fees, etc., there's a lot of profit that's made sort of that is front loaded, that all comes in before the project's even really built. And then as the project gets built, things are flipped. You know, they're sold off to some other company or some real estate investment trust. And so a lot of times these projects, and this is pyrolysis, this is hydrogen, carbon capture, industrial solar, like all of these industries are kind of set up for this to occur. A lot of times it doesn't even really matter if the project works. And that's the trick. It's like, this is more of a financial scheme than a solution for energy or pollution or whatever. It's like, as long as they can sell private equity on the idea of it working, they can flip it, they can make their money, and it just goes, it's like hot potato. It just goes from one investment firm to another investment firm. It flips all these hands. And by the time it actually shows itself to be not a tenable solution, it's the people who are left holding the bag are the community members, the landowners, the farmers. You know, if some pension fund bought the toxic asset thinking that it was a good deal, you know, it's like all these people that are kind of unaware of how all of this works, they're left holding the bag.
Wow. I'm processing all that, and if folks want to support SOBE Concerned Citizens, the citizens of Youngstown, how do you think they can do that, Stuart, best? By contacting EPA and or sending a letter, making a phone call, Ohio EPA that is, and asking them to
Yeah,
permits? I mean, that's.
I mean, the Ohio EPA has a complaint form, and we'll, in the description of this video, we'll post the direct contact information for the Ohio EPA. You can also contact the US EPA Region 5. They have a hotline and an email, which we'll include as well. You can reach out to SOBE Concerned Citizens, the Youngstown City Council, or Beyond Plastics in Ohio. And I'm sure that they'd have information for folks as well.
Basically, to sum it up, chemical recycling, advanced recycling are schemes that the petrochemical plastic industry has come up to greenwash these processes as a solution for plastic pollution, when in fact they would be recycling a small percentage of the plastic. It creates more water, air pollution, harms communities in areas that are already classified as environmental justice communities, and had more than their fair share of health impacts, struggles due to polluting industrial operations.
Yeah, I think that sums it up pretty nicely. And on the kind of behind the scenes in the back end, there's some really shady financial stuff going on. And eventually I'd like to get more into that, but I don't want to talk about it too much before I have a better grasp on it myself. But I think what's really important for people to know is that pyrolysis is only one of many of these false solutions that the industry is promoting as green, renewable, et cetera. And I think that it's insidious in that way. Like, it sounds on the surface like this is a good solution, but time and time again, when you dig into it, it really is not a solution.
Yes, and I also just had the thought, like, educate your regulators, contact your senators, even state, local, federal. I mean, just share the information with whoever you can, even if it's just talking to your friend or this person, someone who might not be overly concerned about these issues, but I still think people on some fundamental level, if they know the truth, and also, like, maybe they'll think twice before they go buy a water bottle, a bottle of water, or try. It's also about reducing every individual's the choices we make can impact even just our own karma. Do you know what I mean? Even if it's just for your own sake, not that, oh, suddenly the solution is everybody stop using plastic. Well, in realistic terms, it's hard to do unless you're overly wealthy or having an overabundance of everything. How much more expensive is it to go, say, to a one of the more prestigious, expensive grocery stores where they have produce that aren't in plastic, but go to a regular, like, go to the grocery store here in town. I can get some onions, maybe some oranges. I mean, everything else that produce wise that I want, or most of the products in the store. No, I don't know if it's most, but you know what I'm trying to say. Plastic is covering, surrounding just everywhere in our society. Like the clothes we wear. So I don't know where maybe I just went down another whole avenue we don't want to go to right now, but
Well, no, I mean, I think it's a good point. Plastic is so ubiquitous in our society that it's hard to get away from, even if you are conscientious about these issues. So partly it's a systemic top-down issue, because there's, like, as long as these industries are being subsidized the way that they are, and as long as they are allowed to create these financial machinations of crazy strategy, there's only so much that we are able to do, because short of living like the Amish, it's very hard to get away from it. But I will also say that you can't totally let consumers off the hook either. And I think I think that the trick is to really educate consumers on what is going on, because the more that I learn about all of this, as we build this show and as I work with you and we meet all these people and we go to these sites, the more that I experience what's actually happening, I can feel myself becoming more and more conscientious about it in my own life.
nice.
And so just telling somebody that plastic's bad and you should reduce your plastic is not enough. that you have to help people actually understand that the production of plastic in this community is clearly doing this or is clearly doing that. You know, you have to educate them, because I think when they are armed with real knowledge, you can't help but start to see things differently. It was snowing so this is off topic, but one of the things that we talk about is the radioactivity in fracking. And, you know, through our work, I have kind of like firsthand seen radioactivity in fields just being left by industry. And it was snowing this morning. And I started to think, does radioactivity travel with water and precipitation? And I don't know what the answer to that is, but I'm just saying that, like, when you experience these things and when you start learning about them, you can't help but start to see the world around you a little differently. And I think that's the only real answer.
Yes, and that's kind of at the core motivation of the work I've been doing all these years. So many individuals and organizations have been doing over these years but for me, it's like the personal stories, like you said, like in community science and working with researchers. And I learned early on, I had to have backup, you know, I had to have others come in with the expertise to verify what I was saying or verify our lived experience. So I had the same experience, like more and more as time goes on. Like now it's also like petrochemicals, PFAS chemicals, forever chemicals, you know, and in the beginning, like 8 years ago when we started fighting the PTTG cracker plant, the ethane cracker plant, they're going to be just similar to Shell, another single-use plastic massive facility in the region. I'm just saying, in the beginning, 8 years ago, I wasn't concerned about the petrochemicals, the PFAS chemicals in the clothes I was purchasing, or the microplastics that are released from your clothes that go into the washer, that go into the water supplies. And I'm always continually learning more about how vast and all-encompassing this issue really is to our quality of life and the life of the planet and our children's future. So that's why we're here today, you know, and trying to highlight the work of some incredible community members and those who support them from afar and other organizations. Like, you know, get up, stand up. Thank you for doing it, you know. Stand up for your right.
Yeah. Yeah, and if anyone is listening wants to support those members in Youngstown, those community members, I think they could really use the help. And please do write into the Ohio EPA to ask to rescind this this air permit, because I don't think that community wants it. That's my
Well,
takeaway.
I think we know they don't, and they've made it very
Yeah.
do not want this. And the regulators should listen. They're not the ones having to live there. Would they want it in their cards? That's the question. And the answer will always be no. You want to drink this water that came from my contaminated well due to a fracking spill? No, they don't. Do they want to live next to it? No, they don't. But let's push it off on, you know, folks in Appalachia and other regions where we've been historically taken advantage of. And, you know, we'll probably be able to pull it off and make a bunch of money and then just leave them worse than they were before we ever showed up. You know, that's the history. People need to know their history and who should have the blame for the circumstances that their communities are dealing with, you know, currently dealing with.
Yeah. Yep. Well, I think that's a good note to end off on, because we could probably talk for a long while more about this, but I'd like to keep it a little focused on the Youngstown thing and the pyrolysis, because I think that's where that's happening now, and I want people to know that, you know.
Yeah, so reach out to SOBE Concerned Citizens and send your comments to Ohio EPA, maybe even potentially write a letter or call federal EPA and say, hey, can you help us out a little more? We appreciate what you've done, but help us get the Ohio EPA to rescind these permits. And talk to your friends, family, like spread the news, spread the awareness, and let's help this movement grow. Guidance, protection, peace.
Thanks, everyone.